From a blown head gasket to a global movement, how one scientist and one farmer are proving resilience starts with the soil. Before we dive into this wild tale, drop a comment. Where are you tuning in from? If this story grabs you, smash that subscribe button. I've got something extra special cooking for tomorrow. A soft pink dawn broke over the endless Kansas prairie, casting a golden glow across the dew-kissed grasses that stretched in every direction. Amelia Winters, a 36-year-old agricultural researcher, was driving along a desolate country road when a faint wisp of smoke curled from beneath the hood of her sedan. Her heart sank as she eased the car onto the narrow, gravel-strewn shoulder, the silence of the remote landscape pressing in around her. She glanced at her GPS, nothing but fields for miles, and then at her phone, which mocked her with a no-service message. Steam hissed ominously from the engine as she stepped out, her polished leather shoes crunching against the gravel. In the distance, a weathered mailbox stood at the end of a long, dusty driveway, its faded lettering barely legible: Jackson Acres, EST 1897. With no other options, Amelia adjusted her silk blouse, already wilting in the rising heat, and began the trek toward what she hoped might be a lifeline, unaware that this unexpected detour would soon ignite a discovery capable of reshaping not just her career but the future of American agriculture itself. The August sun climbed steadily, its unrelenting rays beating down on Amelia as she walked along the dirt path, her briefcase swinging lightly at her side. Sweat beaded on her forehead and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, her thoughts racing. At 36, Amelia had built an impressive reputation as one of the country's leading agricultural researchers, specializing in drought-resistant crop development at the prestigious Barrett Institute in Chicago. Her work had earned her accolades, grants, and a corner office overlooking the city skyline, a far cry from the rural expanse she now found herself stranded in. But in this moment, none of her achievements mattered. She was simply a weary traveler, her tailored slacks gathering dust with every step, hoping for a kind stranger to offer assistance. The farmhouse came into view after what felt like an eternity, though the walk had only taken 15 minutes. It was a two-story structure, its white paint peeling in long, curling strips, revealing the graying wood beneath. A wide front porch wrapped around the front, its green shutters hanging at odd angles, in desperate need of a fresh coat of paint. Beyond the house stood a massive red barn, its color faded to a rusty hue by decades of harsh prairie winds and unrelenting sun. Smaller outbuildings, a tool shed, a chicken coop, and what looked like a greenhouse dotted the property, and in the distance, fields of corn stretched toward the horizon. But something about the fields caught Amelia's professional eye. The corn wasn't planted in the rigid, uniform rows she'd seen on her drive. Instead, the plants grew in swirling, almost hypnotic patterns as if following the natural contours of the land. As she drew closer to the farmhouse, more details piqued her curiosity. Rain barrels sat beneath the downspouts, their weathered surfaces glistening with morning dew. A series of gardens surrounded the house, not in the traditional straight rows she was accustomed to seeing, but in concentric, almost maze-like designs. Native wildflowers, vibrant purples and yellows, grew alongside vegetable plots, their arrangement both chaotic and strangely intentional. Amelia paused, her scientific mind buzzing. These weren't the practices of the industrial farming that dominated the region. She recognized elements of permaculture design, companion planting, water conservation, biodiversity, but she'd rarely seen them implemented on the scale outside of academic papers or experimental plots. She had just reached the creaking steps of the porch when a deep, steady voice called out from behind her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Amelia turned to find a man emerging from one of the outbuildings, his tall, broad-shouldered frame filling the doorway. He appeared to be in his early 40s, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors and eyes the color of rich, fertile soil. His chambray shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, revealing forearms corded with muscle, not the kind built in a gym, but earned through the relentless physical labor of farming. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, the kind of self-assuredness that came from being deeply rooted in his environment. I'm so sorry to intrude, Amelia began, gesturing back toward the road. My car overheated about a mile back. I was hoping I might use your phone to call for help. The man studied her for a moment, taking in her city attire, tailored slacks, a silk blouse now clinging to her skin in the heat, and the briefcase that marked her as an outsider. Despite her disheveled appearance, Amelia held herself with the poised demeanor she'd cultivated in the male-dominated world of academic research. I'm Daniel Jackson, he said at last, stepping forward to extend a calloused hand. Welcome to Jackson Acres. The phone's inside, but I can take a look at your car first if you'd like. Might save you the cost of a tow. Amelia Winters, she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip that belied her exhaustion. That would be incredibly helpful, thank you. Daniel nodded and disappeared into a nearby garage, returning moments later in an old blue pickup truck, its paint chipped but its engine purring steadily. Hop in, he offered, opening the passenger door with a creak. As they drove the short distance back to her car, Daniel shared a bit about Jackson Acres. Been in my family for 4 generations, he said, his voice low and steady. I left for nearly 15 years, but I came back 3 years ago when my father passed. He held on long enough to see me make some changes that saved the place. I'm sorry about your father, Amelia said sincerely. What kind of changes? Daniel glanced at her, a flicker of pride breaking through his reserved demeanor. Let's just say I took the agriculture degree I earned and put it to unconventional use. My dad thought I was out of my mind at first, but the results changed his tune. They reached Amelia's sedan, the steam having subsided but the hood still warm to the touch. Daniel popped the hood and examined the engine with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd fixed more machines than he could count. After a few minutes of poking at hoses and checking the radiator cap, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. Blown head gasket, I'm afraid, he diagnosed. Not something I can fix here. You'll need a mechanic and probably a couple of days for parts and labor. Amelia's carefully planned schedule collapsed in her mind like a house of cards. She was supposed to be evaluating a potential research site in western Kansas by that afternoon, with meetings scheduled first thing the next morning. Is there a rental car place nearby? She asked, mentally calculating distances and timelines. Daniel shook his head. Nearest town with one is about 70 miles west. I can drive you there, but it'll take most of the day. Or you're welcome to use our landline to make your calls, and I can drop you off at the Golden Prairie Motel in town. It's nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe. With limited options, Amelia accepted his offer. They returned to Jackson Acres, where Daniel helped her retrieve her luggage and briefcase from the car before driving her back to the farmhouse. The interior of the farmhouse surprised her. While the architecture was clearly vintage, creaky wooden floors, high ceilings with exposed beams, the space had been thoughtfully updated. The kitchen boasted modern appliances, their stainless steel surfaces gleaming against the backdrop of a butcher block countertop. The living areas were comfortably furnished with a blend of antiques and modern pieces, a plush sofa sitting across from a carved wooden rocking chair that looked like it had been there for a century. Photographs lined one wall, black and white images of generations of the Jackson family working the same land, their faces weathered but proud. Make yourself at home, Daniel said, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Phone's on the wall there. I need to check on something in the barn, but I'll be back shortly to drive you to town. Left alone, Amelia made her necessary calls. A towing service that couldn't arrive until the next day, apologies to her research contacts for the delay, and a reservation at the motel. As she hung up the receiver, her gaze drifted to a framed certificate on the wall. Regenerative Agriculture Innovation Award, presented to Daniel Jackson, Jackson Acres Farm. The name stirred a distant memory, something she'd heard at a conference or read in a journal, though she couldn't place the specific contribution. Her professional curiosity piqued. She glanced out the window toward the barn where Daniel had disappeared. The unusual field patterns she'd noticed earlier tickled the edge of her research mind. With time to kill before Daniel returned, she decided to take a closer look. The heat hit her like a physical force as she stepped back outside, the sun now high in a cloudless sky. She approached the nearest garden, which revealed itself to be far more sophisticated than it had appeared from a distance. Plants were grouped in complementary clusters. Nitrogen-fixing legumes grew alongside nitrogen-hungry vegetables, while flowers that attracted beneficial insects were strategically placed throughout. The design mimicked natural ecosystems, a stark contrast to the regimented rows of traditional agriculture. Amelia crouched down, running her fingers through the soil, noting its rich, loamy texture. This wasn't just gardening, it was a deliberate, scientific approach to farming. It's called a food forest. Daniel's voice came from behind her, causing her to start slightly. He stood a few feet away, a slight smile on his face. Sorry, didn't mean to sneak up on you. No, it's fascinating, Amelia replied, standing and brushing the dirt from her hands. This is permaculture design, isn't it? I've read about the theory, but I've rarely seen it implemented at this scale. Something in Daniel's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise, then appreciation at her recognition. Most visitors just see messy gardens, he said. You've got a good eye. I should have introduced myself more thoroughly, Amelia said, extending her hand again. Dr. Amelia Winters, Agricultural Research Director at the Barrett Institute. Daniel's eyebrows rose, a spark of recognition in his eyes. The Barrett Institute? You're a long way from your laboratories in Chicago. What brings you out here? I was heading to evaluate potential field trial locations for a drought-resistant corn project, she explained. We're looking to establish test plots in several climate zones. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, his gaze sharpening. Drought resistance through genetic modification? There was a hint of wariness in his tone, one Amelia had encountered often in traditional farming communities. That's one approach we're exploring, she acknowledged, her tone measured, along with selective breeding programs and soil microbiome enhancements. Daniel's expression softened slightly as if her answer had passed some unspoken test. Well, Dr. Winters, since you've shown interest in my humble gardens, would you like to see something that might relate to your research? It's in the barn. Curiosity overcame Amelia's awareness that she should probably decline and focus on her disrupted schedule. There was something about Daniel's quiet intensity, the way he spoke of his work with both pride and restraint, that drew her in. Lead the way, Mr. Jackson. Just Daniel, please, he said, guiding her toward the massive red barn. The barn doors slid open with a deep rumble, revealing a space that immediately challenged Amelia's expectations. She had anticipated hay bales, farm equipment, perhaps a tractor or two. Instead, one entire section of the barn had been transformed into what could only be described as a laboratory. Computer stations lined one wall, their screens displaying data charts and growth models. Climate-controlled growing chambers housed plants in various stages of development, their LED lights casting a soft glow across the space. Experimental growing beds held corn plants rooted in specially formulated soil mixtures, connected to a sophisticated irrigation system that appeared to be automated. Amelia stopped in her tracks, momentarily speechless. This wasn't the hobby setup of an interested farmer. This was professional-grade research equipment, some of it matching the cutting-edge technology she used at the Barrett Institute. What exactly am I looking at, Daniel? She asked, her voice tinged with awe. My life's work, he replied simply, stepping over to one of the monitors. A breeding program for corn varieties that can thrive in drought conditions without genetic modification. We use symbiotic relationships with mycorrhizal fungi and adapted soil bacteria to enhance resilience. He pulled up a chart showing a 40% reduction in water requirements compared to standard varieties, alongside yield increases rather than reductions. That's remarkable, Amelia said, examining the nearest plants with a newfound respect. The corn stalks were healthy, their leaves a vibrant green despite the drought conditions that had plagued the region for months. How long have you been developing this? About 7 years of focused work, Daniel said, his tone matter-of-fact but his eyes alight with passion. Though the ideas started forming during my PhD at Cornell. My dissertation advisor thought I was throwing away my career when I decided to come back here and implement these approaches instead of taking a research position. The pieces suddenly clicked in Amelia's mind. Wait, Daniel Jackson from Cornell? You published that controversial paper on integrated mycorrhizal networks in 2011. Daniel's expression brightened with recognition. You've read it? Of course, she said, a smile tugging at her lips. It was brilliant if unorthodox. The establishment dismissed it as theoretical with limited practical applications. She gestured at the lab around them. But you've been quietly proving them wrong all these years. Not so quietly, he corrected, a hint of defiance in his voice. I've published the results in agricultural journals, but without the backing of a major research institution or agribusiness funding, it doesn't get much attention. As they continued through the barn, Amelia's assessment of both Daniel and Jackson Acres underwent a seismic shift. What had appeared from the road to be a quaint family farm was actually the site of groundbreaking agricultural research approaching the same problems her team tackled, but from an ecological rather than technological perspective. In one corner stood a sophisticated soil testing station where Daniel analyzed microbiome composition, his microscope slides revealing intricate fungal networks that connected plant roots. Another area housed a seed bank of heritage corn varieties, their genetic diversity forming the foundation of his breeding program. The level of scientific rigor was undeniable, even as it challenged many of the fundamental assumptions that drove research at institutions like hers. Why work in isolation? She asked finally, her voice tinged with both admiration and frustration. This research could benefit from collaboration with larger institutions. Daniel's expression grew guarded, his shoulders tensing slightly. I've tried, he said. 3 times, I approached major agricultural research centers with my findings. Each time, they expressed interest in acquiring my seed stock and data, but not in preserving the holistic approach that makes it successful. Amelia nodded, understanding dawning. They wanted to extract the genetics but ignore the soil biology and planting methods. Exactly, Daniel said, his voice hardening. These plants don't succeed because of a single genetic trait that can be isolated and patented. They thrive because of relationships with soil fungi, with companion plants, with the specific microbiome we've cultivated. His passion broke through his reserved exterior as he spoke. Industrial agriculture wants silver bullet solutions they can sell in bags and bottles. I'm offering a gold standard approach that requires fundamentally rethinking how we grow food. Amelia felt a strange tension building within her. Professionally, she should be skeptical of claims that hadn't been validated through traditional scientific channels. Yet everything she saw in Daniel's barn spoke to meticulous research methodology and promising results. The agricultural researcher in her was deeply impressed, while the corporate institute director recognized the disruptive potential of his work to the very funding models that supported her career. Daniel, she said after a moment, would you be willing to show me your field implementations? I'd like to see how these principles scale beyond the controlled environment. Something shifted in his demeanor, a cautious opening like a rare flower unfurling in the sun. It would be my pleasure, Dr. Winters, he said. Though I should warn you, once you see agriculture as relationships rather than commodities, it's hard to look at a conventional farm the same way again. They stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, the heat still oppressive but the air buzzing with possibility. Neither of them could have predicted how this chance encounter would eventually challenge the foundations of American agriculture, spark controversy within the highest levels of research institutions, and ultimately forge an unlikely partnership that would help farmers across the drought-plagued Great Plains rediscover resilience in the face of climate change. For now, they were simply 2 passionate agricultural experts from different worlds about to walk fields that told a story of possibility neither had fully imagined before their paths crossed on a sweltering Kansas highway. Daniel's diagnosis of Amelia's car proved correct. The local mechanic in Golden Prairie, a small town of barely 2,000 souls, its main street lined with a diner, a hardware store, and a few shuttered storefronts, confirmed the blown head gasket. "Parts'll take at least 3 days to arrive, ma'am," the mechanic said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that looked as old as the town itself. "Could try to rush it, but even then it's 2 days minimum." Amelia sighed, the implications rippling through her tightly scheduled life. She had presentations to deliver, meetings to attend, and grant proposals due by the end of the week. The thought of being stranded in the speck on the map sent a wave of anxiety through her, but she had no choice. She settled into the Golden Prairie Motel, its flickering neon sign and dated decor a stark contrast to the sleek Chicago hotels she was accustomed to. The room smelled faintly of mildew and the air conditioner rattled with every cycle, but it was a place to rest and think. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Amelia opened her laptop and typed Daniel Jackson Cornell Mycorrhizal Networks into a search engine. What emerged was a fascinating portrait of a brilliant mind that had deliberately stepped off the traditional path of academic success. Daniel had been a rising star in agricultural science, completing his PhD at Cornell with honors and publishing several well-received papers on plant-fungal symbiosis. His early career trajectory suggested he would become a leading researcher at a prestigious institution. Then, abruptly, he disappeared from academic publications for nearly 5 years. When his name resurfaced, it was in smaller agricultural journals and farmer-focused publications rather than prestigious scientific periodicals. His focus had shifted from theoretical models to practical implementations, and his approach had become more holistic, integrating indigenous farming knowledge with cutting-edge soil microbiology. One particular article caught her attention, The False Promise of Silver Bullet Solutions in Agricultural Resilience by Daniel Jackson, published in a sustainable farming journal 3 years ago. The piece was a passionate yet meticulously researched critique of the single-gene modification approach favored by institutions like the Barrett Institute, where Amelia had built her career. Daniel argued that such approaches created dependencies, farmers reliant on patented seeds, expensive inputs, and water-intensive methods rather than fostering true resilience. His words struck a chord with doubts Amelia had harbored for years but rarely voiced, even to herself. She read deep into the night, her professional worldview simultaneously challenged and expanded by his perspective. The next morning, when she met Daniel at Jackson Acres as arranged, Amelia arrived with questions that went beyond scientific curiosity. "Your article on silver bullet solutions," she began as they walked toward a field of corn planted in sinuous curves rather than straight rows, "was that directed at researchers like me?" Daniel considered her question, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as they walked. "Not at researchers like you specifically," he said finally. "More at a system that incentivizes certain types of solutions over others, quick fixes over systemic changes, patentable technologies over ecological approaches." Instead of defensiveness, Amelia felt an unexpected resonance with his critique. "I've had similar thoughts," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "But the funding flows toward technology-driven approaches. You can't patent a farming method or an ecosystem." "And that's precisely the problem," Daniel replied, stopping at the edge of the field. "Now let me show you why these curves matter." For the next several hours, Daniel guided Amelia through what he called his integrated resilience system. The curved planting patterns, he explained, followed the natural contours of the land, reducing erosion and creating microclimates that retained moisture. Between the main crop rows grew carefully selected companion plants, clover to fix nitrogen, marigolds to deter pests, and wildflowers to attract beneficial insects. "This section hasn't received irrigation in 6 weeks, he noted, gesturing to thriving corn plants, their stalks tall and leaves a vibrant green despite the drought. The soil structure and fungal networks retain moisture in ways conventional fields can't match." As impressive as the fields were, it was Daniel's story that began to captivate Amelia even more. As they walked the property, he gradually revealed the journey that had transformed him from academic researcher to hands-on agricultural innovator. I was on track for a research professorship, he explained as they paused beneath the shade of a windbreak composed of native trees and shrubs, cottonwoods and redbuds that provided habitat for birds and insects while shielding the fields from harsh winds. Good publications, promising grand prospects. Then my mother called to tell me Dad had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. Daniel had returned to help manage the farm, initially planning to hire a manager and return to academia. But what he found horrified him. Years of conventional farming practices had depleted the soil on his family's land. His father, pressured by mounting debt and declining yields, had become increasingly dependent on expensive inputs, fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, that promised to maintain productivity but actually accelerated the soil's degradation. Dad was caught in a cycle he couldn't escape, Daniel said, his voice tight with remembered pain. Each year, it took more chemicals to grow the same amount of food, and each year, the soil died a little more. The loans for those inputs piled up and the stress accelerated his condition. Daniel had faced a crucial decision: return to the academic world where his research might eventually influence agricultural practices, or stay and attempt to save his family's farm by implementing his theories directly. He chose the latter, beginning a radical transformation of Jackson Acres that his father initially resisted but eventually embraced. The first year was brutal, he admitted, leading Amelia toward a small orchard where fruit trees, apple, pear, and cherry, grew among berry bushes and flowering herbs. I had to break the addiction to chemical inputs while the soil was still essentially dead. Yields dropped by 30%, and the bank nearly foreclosed. Even the local farmers thought I'd lost my mind. The eccentric professor destroying his family's legacy. That first difficult season was followed by a gradual rebirth. Daniel introduced cover crops, rye and vetch, to rebuild soil structure, adopted minimal tillage to preserve fungal networks, and began re-establishing the beneficial microbial communities that supported his plants. The farm slowly awakened. By the third year, yields had recovered to conventional levels but with a fraction of the inputs. By year 5, Jackson Acres was outperforming neighboring farms, using 60% less water and almost no chemical fertilizers or pesticides. Dad lived long enough to see it work, Daniel said quietly, his gaze distant as he looked out over the fields. His last coherent day, he walked these fields with me and said, "The land is alive again. I can feel it." Amelia found herself processing not just the agricultural innovations she'd witnessed, but the human story behind them. Daniel had sacrificed a prestigious career to save his family farm, and in doing so had developed practical applications of theories that most academics considered promising but unproven. Over a lunch of fresh vegetables harvested from Daniel's gardens, crisp lettuce, sweet tomatoes, and tender zucchini paired with iced tea infused with mint from his herb plot, Amelia shared her own journey. Unlike Daniel, she hadn't grown up in an agricultural family. Her path to agricultural science had been paved with academic achievement rather than practical experience. Born to university professors in Chicago, her mother an economist, her father a chemist, Amelia had been raised in an environment that prized intellectual achievement above all else. Her childhood memories included lecture halls and libraries rather than fields or barns. "I fell in love with plants in the university botanical garden," she explained, sipping her tea as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves outside the kitchen window. "They had this magnificent conservatory where I would hide and read for hours. Something about the way plants silently solve problems, adapting to their environments without complaint or drama, resonated with me." Her undergraduate degree in botany had led to graduate work in agricultural science, where her innovative approaches to drought resistance had caught the attention of the Barrett Institute. At 30, she had become their youngest research director, overseeing projects worth millions in funding and guiding the work of scientists twice her age. The Barrett approach focuses on engineering plants to withstand environmental stresses, she explained. "We identify genes responsible for drought tolerance in desert plants and integrate them into crop genomes, or we modify existing plant genes to enhance their stress responses. Daniel listened attentively, asking insightful questions that revealed his deep understanding of the field despite his unconventional path. Your modified corn strain showed remarkable results in the Texas trials last year, he acknowledged. A 47% yield increase under severe drought conditions is impressive by any standard. Amelia was momentarily taken aback. You've been following our work? I follow all significant drought resistance research, Daniel replied with a small smile. Know your allies and your competition equally well. That's something my father taught me. And which category does the Barrett Institute fall into? Amelia asked, curious despite herself. Daniel considered the question, his expression thoughtful. Neither, yet. You're pursuing the same goal through a different path. The question is whether those paths are complementary or contradictory in the long term. As their conversation deepened, Amelia found herself sharing professional doubts she rarely voiced, even to colleagues. The Barrett Institute's singular focus on genetic solutions sometimes felt incomplete to her. Watching farmers apply their modified seeds in the same depleted soils using the same water-intensive methods, she questioned whether they were creating lasting solutions or expensive dependencies. Sometimes I wonder if we're just developing better plants for a broken system, she admitted, her voice quiet but firm. A system that's fundamentally unsustainable regardless of how drought-tolerant the crops become. Daniel nodded, a flash of understanding passing between them. That's the central question, isn't it? Do we adapt plants to survive within our damaged agricultural systems, or do we transform the systems themselves? After lunch, Daniel showed her the heart of his research operation, a sophisticated soil testing laboratory housed in what had once been a storage shed. Here, he monitored the complex relationships between plants, fungi, bacteria, and other soil organisms that made his approach successful. Most agricultural research focuses on what happens above ground, he explained, showing her microscope images of fungal hyphae that connected his corn plants like a vast underground network. But at least half the action is happening below the surface. The invisible networks he studied created efficient pathways for water and nutrients, allowing plants to communicate and share resources during drought. These networks redistributed moisture from areas of abundance to stressed plants. When pests attacked, they transmitted chemical warning signals that allowed other plants to activate their natural defenses. It's a biological internet, Amelia murmured, fascinated by the complexity Daniel was revealing. And conventional agriculture essentially cuts the connections with each tillage pass and fungicide application. Exactly, Daniel confirmed. We've been treating soil like an inert growing medium rather than a living community. My work is about restoring those connections and letting the natural systems do what they evolved to do over millions of years. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Amelia found herself reluctant to return to her motel room. The contrast between the sterile laboratories where she normally worked and this living demonstration of ecological principles was profound. Here, theory and practice merged seamlessly, with tangible results growing in every field. I should get you back to town, Daniel said, finally noticing the lengthening shadows. But I'd be happy to continue this tomorrow if you're interested. I'm harvesting the north field in the morning, and it might give you a chance to see how these principles translate to yield data. I'd like that, Amelia replied, surprised by her own eagerness. My institute colleagues would never believe I spent my breakdown-induced vacation watching regenerative agriculture in action. Daniel's expression turned curious. How would they react if they knew you were here? The question gave Amelia pause. The Barrett Institute maintained research partnerships with several major agribusiness corporations. Companies that viewed approaches like Daniel's as threats to their business model, which relied on patented seeds, chemical inputs, and specialized equipment. Some would be fascinated, she said finally. Others would question my scientific objectivity for even considering alternative approaches. The Institute leadership. She trailed off, remembering pointed comments from the board chair about anti-science attitudes among organic farming advocates. They'd view it as fraternizing with the enemy, Daniel suggested, his tone light but his eyes serious. Not the enemy, Amelia corrected carefully, but perhaps a competing paradigm that challenges their fundamental assumptions, which, in scientific institutions, often amounts to the same thing. That evening, as Amelia sat on the small porch of the Golden Prairie Motel, watching the sunset paint the Kansas sky in spectacular oranges and pinks, she found herself at an unexpected crossroads. Her professional life had been built on the premise that technological innovation, genetic engineering, specifically, represented the best path toward agricultural resilience in a changing climate. Yet Daniel's integrated approach had demonstrated remarkable results without complex technology or massive research budgets. His fields thrived despite drought conditions that stressed neighboring farms. His crops showed natural resistance to pests without chemical treatments, and most importantly, his system improved with each season as soil health increased, rather than requiring ever greater inputs to maintain productivity. Amelia opened her laptop, creating a new document titled Jackson Acres Observations. As a scientist, she needed to process what she'd witnessed systematically, separating empirical observations from emotional responses. But as the list grew, she found herself documenting not just agricultural techniques but personal reflections. One particularly revealing entry read, "Question to explore, has institutional agriculture's emphasis on technological solutions blinded us to ecological approaches that might be more sustainable long-term? Have we been so focused on engineering better plants that we've forgotten the importance of the systems in which they grow?" The questions felt almost heretical given her position at the Barrett Institute, yet they resonated with doubts she'd harbored for years. Tomorrow's visit might provide more answers or perhaps more complicated questions. Either way, Amelia realized she was approaching Daniel's farm not just as a stranded traveler or curious scientist, but as someone standing at the threshold of a potentially transformative insight. As she closed her laptop, her phone chimed with an email notification. The Barrett Institute director wanted a progress update on her site selection for the drought-resistant corn trials. Amelia stared at the message, the familiar demands of her professional life suddenly feeling distant. For the first time in years, she set the phone aside without immediately responding, choosing instead to watch the final moments of the sunset and contemplate the remarkable agricultural ecosystem she'd witnessed at Jackson Acres. The following morning, the harvest moon hung low and full over Jackson Acres, casting long shadows across the fields as Daniel guided his combine through rows of corn in the pre-dawn hours. Amelia sat in the passenger seat, her notebook open on her lap, watching in fascination as the machine gathered stalks with remarkable efficiency, its headlights illuminating the unusual planting patterns that define Daniel's approach. "Most farmers don't harvest at night," she observed, the machine's rumble a steady backdrop to their conversation. "The moisture content is optimal," Daniel explained, his attention divided between their discussion and the careful operation of the equipment. "And there's something almost meditative about it. My grandfather used to say the truth of farming reveals itself when you work with the rhythms of the earth rather than fighting against them." As the combine moved steadily through the field, Amelia was struck by the quality of the crop. Despite the severe drought conditions that had plagued the region for months, Daniel's corn stood tall and healthy, each ear fully developed. More surprising was the biodiversity visible even in the beam of the headlights. Beneficial insects flitted between plants, unexpected flowering species grew between rows, and the soil beneath showed signs of a thriving microbial community that conventional fields rarely exhibited. "Your yield monitors are showing impressive numbers," she noted, observing the digital display that tracked bushels per acre in real time. "At least 15% higher than the county average, according to the Extension Office reports I checked yesterday. And with approximately 70% less irrigation and 85% less chemical input," Daniel added, his tone devoid of pride, simply stating facts. "But the yield numbers only tell part of the story. The nutritional density is significantly higher as well. The complex fungal networks help plants access micronutrients that remain locked away in conventionally farmed soils." As the sun crested the horizon, painting the Kansas sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Amelia found herself mentally calculating the implications of Daniel's results, if scaled across the millions of acres of farmland currently struggling with drought throughout the Great Plains. The potential impact on food security, water conservation, and climate resilience was staggering. The Barrett Institute spends millions on developing drought-resistant crops, she said as Daniel brought the combine to a halt at the edge of the field. But your approach suggests we might be solving the wrong problem, or at least an incomplete one. Daniel cut the engine, the sudden silence accentuating the morning sounds of birds and insects awakening around them. Genetic modifications can play a role, he acknowledged, surprising her with his moderation. But they're most effective when integrated into healthy agricultural ecosystems rather than used as band-aids on dying ones. They climbed down from the combine, the morning dew soaking their boots as they walked toward an area where several local farmers had begun to gather. Daniel had mentioned that a few progressive neighbors had expressed interest in his methods, but Amelia was surprised to see nearly a dozen people assembled near the field's edge, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious. The Jackson Acres Field Day begins, Daniel explained quietly as they approached. No PowerPoints, no corporate sponsorship, just farmers looking at results and asking questions. What followed was unlike any agricultural demonstration Amelia had witnessed in her professional career. Rather than carefully scripted presentations emphasizing product benefits and return on investment, Daniel simply walked the group through his fields, digging soil samples, examining plant health, and explaining the principles behind his integrated approach. He acknowledged challenges honestly, pointed out areas still needing improvement, and emphasized the importance of tailoring the system to each farm's specific conditions rather than applying a universal formula. Most striking was the dialogue between the farmers. Practical questions about implementation costs, transition strategies, and how Daniel's methods could be adapted to different scales and crops. These weren't abstract academic discussions but pragmatic considerations from people whose livelihoods depended on making the right choices for their land. I tried cover crops last year after you suggested it, a weather-beaten farmer in his 60s told Daniel, his hands stained with years of soil work. My irrigation needs dropped by almost 30%. But the bank loan officer looked at me like I was speaking Martian when I tried to explain why I was spending money on seeds I wasn't going to harvest. Daniel nodded in understanding. The financial structures of conventional agriculture don't account for investments in soil health. They're designed for a system that prioritizes immediate yield over long-term resilience. That's the biggest barrier to adoption. Another farmer, a woman with a sharp gaze and a no-nonsense demeanor, added, "We all see your results, Daniel, but making the transition while meeting loan payments and cash flow needs is the real challenge." As the conversation continued, Amelia found herself drawn into the discussion, initially listening but eventually offering insights from her own research. When she explained how certain bacterial communities could enhance drought resilience at the root level, the farmers engaged with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that bridged the gap between academic research and practical application. Mid-morning, as the group moved toward the farmhouse where Daniel had prepared refreshments, lemonade made from his orchard's fruit, homemade bread, and fresh vegetables from his gardens, Amelia found herself deep in conversation with Rebecca Torres, a third-generation farmer whose family operated one of the largest agricultural operations in the county. Daniel's methods work on his scale, Rebecca said, her pragmatism evident in both her tone and the careful way she evaluated the fields around them. But I'm responsible for 3,000 acres and employing 27 people. I can't afford to experiment with the whole operation. What about a pilot program? Amelia suggested, her mind already racing with possibilities. Implementing these principles on a portion of your land would allow you to compare results directly while managing risk. Rebecca's expression grew thoughtful. We have a 40-acre section that's been underperforming for years, she said. The soil's practically dead from decades of overtillage and chemical dependency. Might be worth trying something different there, since conventional approaches aren't working anyway. This exchange sparked an idea that would later prove transformative. As the informal field day continued, Amelia found herself sketching out the framework for what she tentatively called a resilience transition network, a structured approach to helping conventional farmers implement regenerative principles incrementally, with data collection protocols that could quantify the results in terms that both agricultural scientists and financial institutions would recognize. During a break in the proceedings, she shared her nascent concept with Daniel. What these farmers need isn't just information about alternative methods, she explained, her voice animated with possibility. They need a pathway that addresses the practical and financial challenges of transition. Daniel listened intently, his expression growing animated as Amelia outlined her vision for a network that would combine his ecological farming approaches with rigorous scientific validation and targeted financial strategies to support farmers during the transition period. The Barrett Institute has the resources and credibility to establish the scientific protocols, she continued, caught up in the possibilities. And you have the practical knowledge and demonstrated results. Together, we could create something that bridges the gap between regenerative ideals and conventional agricultural realities. You're talking about a fundamental shift in how agricultural research is both conducted and implemented, Daniel observed, both excitement and caution in his voice. How would your institute react to such a proposal? It challenges many of their core assumptions. The question gave Amelia pause. The Barrett Institute's funding came primarily from corporations and foundations with deep ties to conventional agriculture. Her proposal would implicitly acknowledge that the Institute's current approach, developing patentable genetic modifications, addressed only part of the agricultural resilience challenge. It would be controversial, she admitted, but the data from your farm is compelling. If we could demonstrate similar results across different scales and conditions, it would be difficult to dismiss. Their conversation was interrupted by a call for Daniel to address some questions from the assembled farmers, but the seed of collaboration had been planted. As Amelia watched him explain the mycorrhizal networks that formed the foundation of his approach, kneeling in the dirt to show the farmers a handful of soil teeming with life, she found herself mentally drafting a research proposal that would merge their complementary expertise. The afternoon brought another unexpected development when Rebecca Torres approached Amelia as the event was winding down. "I've been thinking about your pilot program suggestion," the farmer said without preamble, her arms crossed but her tone open. "If you're serious about collecting data on transition methods, I'd be willing to offer that 40-acre parcel as a test case." "That would be invaluable," Amelia replied, surprised and pleased by the offer. "Having a larger-scale implementation would significantly strengthen any findings. But I'd need technical support," Rebecca continued, her pragmatism unwavering. "And some assurance that if yields drop during the transition, I'm not left holding the bag financially." This practical concern crystallized another component of Amelia's emerging vision, the need for financial mechanisms that could buffer farmers from transition risks. Crop insurance programs, agricultural subsidies, and lending practices were all designed around conventional farming models. Creating pathways for regenerative agriculture would require innovations in financial structures as well as farming techniques. As the golden light of late afternoon stretched across the Kansas landscape, the informal gathering began to disperse. Farmers returned to their own operations, many clearly mulling over what they'd witnessed. Several made arrangements with Daniel for follow-up visits or soil testing, signs that his influence was gradually expanding beyond Jackson Acres. Walking back toward the farmhouse with Daniel, Amelia felt a familiar energetic buzz that always accompanied the birth of a significant research direction. Her mind was racing with possibilities, connections, and potential approaches to the challenges they'd identified. "You're thinking very loudly," Daniel observed with a slight smile, his voice pulling her out of her thoughts. "I'm seeing connections that I've been missing for years," Amelia admitted. "My work has been so focused on making plants more resilient to environmental stresses, but your approach suggests we need to make the entire agricultural system more resilient." The soil, the microbial communities, the water cycles, the economic structures. It's the difference between engineering better components for a flawed machine versus redesigning the machine itself. Exactly, Daniel agreed. And both approaches might have value if we can integrate them effectively. The conversation continued over dinner, prepared from ingredients grown on Jackson Acres, a simple but delicious meal of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a salad that embodied the principles they had discussed throughout the day. As twilight deepened into evening, they moved to the farmhouse porch, where the conversation shifted from scientific possibilities to practical next steps. Your car will be repaired soon, Daniel noted, the first acknowledgement of Amelia's temporary status in Golden Prairie. What happens when you return to the Barrett Institute? The question brought Amelia's professional reality into sharp focus. Her unexpected detour to Jackson Acres had opened perspectives that would be difficult to integrate into her institutional role, yet she couldn't simply abandon years of research and the resources that the Institute provided. I need to find a way to bridge these worlds, she said finally. The Institute has capabilities that could accelerate and validate your work, and your approaches could address limitations in our current research directions. But will they be open to that bridge? Daniel asked, the practical question hanging in the air between them. Before Amelia could answer, her phone chimed with an incoming call. Dr. Lawrence Barton, the Institute's director and her direct supervisor, was on the line. With an apologetic glance at Daniel, she answered. Amelia, where are we on the drought resistance field trials? Dr. Barton's voice was crisp, efficiency embodied. The board is asking for updates on site selection. I've encountered a slight delay, she replied, choosing her words carefully. My car broke down in central Kansas, but it's led to an unexpected research opportunity. I've been observing some remarkable results with alternative drought resistance approaches. A pause on the line suggested surprise. Alternative approaches? You mean non-GMO breeding programs? More comprehensive than that, Amelia said, meeting Daniel's gaze across the porch. Integrated systems that address soil health, mycorrhizal networks, and planting methodologies alongside crop genetics. Sounds like you've stumbled into some organic farming operation, Dr. Barton said, his tone indicating he considered this a distraction rather than an opportunity. Interesting anecdotally, perhaps, but hardly relevant to our research priorities. Amelia felt a flash of frustration at the dismissal. Actually, Lawrence, the preliminary data I'm seeing suggests yields comparable to or exceeding our modified strains with significantly reduced input costs and water usage. Anecdotal results without controlled conditions or peer review came the predictable response. When can you resume the planned site evaluations? My car should be repaired by tomorrow, Amelia said, making a sudden decision. But I'd like to extend my stay here for 2 more days to collect additional data. I believe it could inform our drought resistance program in invaluable ways. The silence that followed suggested Dr. Barton was weighing whether to approve this deviation from the established research plan. 2 days, he said finally. But I expect a full briefing when you return. And remember that our funding partners are expecting progress on the modified strain trials, not detours into alternative agriculture. After ending the call, Amelia found Daniel watching her with a mix of understanding and curiosity. Institutional inertia, she explained with a rueful smile. New paradigms are rarely welcomed, especially when they threaten established funding streams and research agendas. So where does that leave your bridge-building aspirations? Daniel asked. Instead of discouragement, Amelia felt a growing determination. We need empirical data that's too compelling to dismiss, not just from Jackson Acres, but from multiple sites, multiple scales, with rigorous controls and documentation. A research network. A research network, Daniel echoed, his voice thoughtful. Yes, but independent of any single institution's constraints, Amelia added, her mind racing ahead, envisioning a collaborative structure that could unite researchers, farmers, and funding sources around an integrated approach to agricultural resilience. As the evening progressed, their conversation evolved from theoretical possibilities to concrete planning. By the time the moon had risen high over Jackson Acres, they had outlined the framework for what would eventually become the Heartland Resilience Network, a collaborative initiative that would challenge conventional agricultural research paradigms while offering practical pathways for farmers facing the mounting pressures of climate change. The following morning brought unexpected momentum to their emerging vision. Rebecca Torres arrived at Jackson Acres with her farm manager and soil specialist, ready to discuss specific implementation plans for the 40-acre pilot project. Word had spread among the local farming community about potential alternatives to the chemical-dependent approaches that were failing in the face of prolonged drought. What had begun as a chance encounter triggered by a blown head gasket was rapidly evolving into something neither Amelia nor Daniel had anticipated. A grassroots movement combining scientific rigor with practical farming knowledge, addressing agricultural challenges from the soil up rather than from the laboratory down. As they walked the boundaries of Jackson Acres, discussing logistics for data collection and knowledge sharing, Amelia reflected on the serendipity that had brought her to this place. Her carefully planned career path had taken an unexpected detour, revealing possibilities that might otherwise have remained undiscovered. "You know," Daniel said, seemingly reading her thoughts, "my father used to say that the most important growth often happens in the spaces between our plans." The observation resonated deeply with Amelia. Her scheduled site visits and research protocols had been interrupted, creating space for a more fundamental reevaluation of her work and its potential impact. The transformation that had begun with Daniel's farm was extending outward, creating ripples that would soon reach her institute and beyond. What neither of them could foresee was how quickly those ripples would become waves, challenging entrenched agricultural paradigms and catalyzing conflicts that would test their developing partnership. The seeds of change had been planted, but the path to harvest would prove more complex and demanding than either scientist anticipated. 6 weeks after her car broke down outside Jackson Acres, Amelia stood before the Barrett Institute's executive committee in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Chicago's gleaming skyline. Behind her, a presentation displayed soil health metrics, comparative yield data, and financial projections for what she had now formally named the Integrated Agricultural Resilience Initiative. "The preliminary results from the Kansas field trials suggest we've been addressing only half the drought resistance equation," she explained, maintaining her professional composure despite the skeptical expressions facing her. "Genetic modifications show promise, but when combined with regenerative soil practices, the results are exponentially better." Lawrence Barton, the Institute's director, leaned forward with the practiced patience of someone humoring an otherwise valuable employee. "While your enthusiasm is commendable, Amelia, this proposal represents a significant deviation from our established research focus. Our funding partners have invested millions in genetic solutions, and they'll see greater returns if we expand our approach," Amelia countered, advancing to a slide showing side-by-side comparisons. "The Torres Farm pilot project is already demonstrating that our drought-resistant corn performs 23% better in soil managed with these regenerative practices than in conventionally managed fields. We're literally handicapping our own technology by ignoring the growing environment." Margaret Chen, the Institute's chief financial officer, adjusted her glasses as she studied the numbers. "These economic projections assume transitions at scale. The initial implementation costs would be substantial, as are the long-term savings," Amelia responded. "Our data shows a 60% reduction in irrigation requirements and an 85% decrease in chemical inputs by the third year. The ROI is compelling, especially as water becomes increasingly scarce and input costs rise." The discussion continued for nearly an hour, with the committee raising objections that Amelia had anticipated and prepared for. She maintained her scientific credibility while advocating for an expanded vision that had been forming since her days at Jackson Acres. What she proposed wasn't abandoning the Institute's genetic research, but integrating it with ecological approaches that could multiply its effectiveness. When the meeting concluded, Amelia had secured neither a clear victory nor a definitive rejection. The committee would take her proposal under advisement, institutional language for deliberate delay. As she gathered her materials, Lawrence approached her privately. "That was quite a performance," he said, his tone somewhere between admiration and concern. "But you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Agricor and Biochem Solutions are our biggest funding partners. They don't profit from farmers using fewer chemicals or seeds that don't need replacement every year." "This isn't about corporate profits," Amelia replied, maintaining her professional demeanor despite her frustration. "It's about agricultural resilience in the face of climate change. Even Agricor's shareholders will suffer if the Midwestern farming system collapses under intensifying drought conditions." Lawrence's expression softened slightly. "I don't disagree with the science, Amelia, but institutions change slowly and funding realities matter. Give me some time to find a path forward that doesn't alienate our supporters." As Amelia left the Barrett Institute that evening, the Chicago autumn wind whipping between skyscrapers, she found herself pulled between two worlds. Her professional identity and financial security were rooted in the Institute's prestigious research position, yet her scientific integrity and growing conviction were increasingly aligned with the integrated approach she had witnessed at Jackson Acres. Her phone chimed with a text message from Daniel. How did the committee respond? She hesitated before typing, institutional inertia as expected, but no outright rejection. "How's Rebecca's pilot project progressing?" His response came quickly. "Soil microbial diversity increased 40% since implementation. First cover crop emerging strong. Local AG Extension Office requesting a field day next month." The message was accompanied by a photograph showing delicate green shoots emerging from soil that just weeks earlier had been compacted and lifeless from decades of industrial farming practices. The image crystallized something in Amelia's thinking. Whatever the Barrett Institute decided, the work in Kansas was generating momentum of its own. Over the following weeks, Amelia maintained her official research duties while devoting evenings and weekends to what colleagues were now calling her Kansas Project. She established rigorous data collection protocols for the Torres Farm pilot program, coordinating with Daniel remotely and making weekend trips when possible. What began as a single pilot project expanded organically as neighboring farmers, witnessing the early results on Rebecca's land, requested guidance for their own transitions. A local agricultural extension agent, initially skeptical, became an unexpected ally after soil testing revealed dramatic improvements in formerly depleted fields. 3 months after her initial presentation, the Barrett Institute's executive committee finally rendered their decision. Amelia was summoned to Lawrence's office, where he delivered the news with diplomatic care. "The committee has approved a limited research initiative exploring complementary approaches to drought resistance," he began, choosing his words precisely. "You'll be allocated resources to continue data collection from your Kansas sites, with quarterly progress reviews." Amelia recognized the compromise for what it was, neither the full institutional embrace she had hoped for nor the rejection she had feared. "And the integration with our genetic research programs?" she asked. Lawrence hesitated. "That aspect is still under consideration. Agricor has expressed concerns about potential conflicts with their product development roadmap." The subtext was clear. The corporate interests that funded much of the Institute's research were uncomfortable with approaches that might reduce farmer dependence on their products. The approval was designed to contain Amelia's work as a separate, limited initiative rather than allowing it to influence the Institute's primary research direction. "I understand," she said, accepting the reality while already calculating alternative strategies. "Thank you for advocating on behalf of the project." That evening, Amelia called Daniel from her apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, the city lights reflecting on the water as she explained the Institute's decision. "It's a start," Daniel said, his voice carrying through the speakerphone. Limited resources are better than no resources. But it's not enough, Amelia replied, watching a distant freighter move across the horizon. The Institute is treating this as a side project while continuing to pour millions into narrowly focused genetic solutions. So what's next? Daniel asked the practical question that had come to characterize their collaboration. Amelia had been considering this question for weeks, mapping possibilities against constraints. We need to demonstrate the integrated approach at a scale that's impossible to dismiss, not just Rebecca's 40 acres, but multiple farms across different agricultural regions, with rigorous data collection and economic analysis. That would require significant funding and coordination beyond what either of us can provide alone, Daniel observed. Which is why I've scheduled meetings with the Heartland Agricultural Foundation and the Climate Resilience Fund next week, Amelia revealed. Both organizations have expressed interest in supporting systemic approaches to agricultural sustainability. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as Amelia leveraged her professional reputation to secure meetings with potential funding partners while maintaining her duties at the Barrett Institute. Daniel expanded outreach to farmers across Kansas and neighboring states, organizing field days that demonstrated the early results from Rebecca's pilot project and his own established systems at Jackson Acres. What emerged was the framework for what they began calling the Heartland Resilience Network, a collaborative initiative that would connect farmers implementing regenerative practices with researchers documenting outcomes and financial experts developing transition models that address the economic challenges of change. The network concept gained unexpected momentum when Simon Garcia, a wealthy tech entrepreneur with family roots in agriculture, attended one of Daniel's field days while visiting relatives in Kansas. Impressed by the integrated approach and its potential impact on both climate resilience and rural economic stability, he offered initial funding for a coordinating center that could systematize the knowledge sharing and data collection. My grandfather lost his farm during the 1980s farm crisis, Simon explained during a video conference with Amelia and Daniel. He was caught in the same trap many farmers face today, increasing input costs, weather volatility, and financial structures that don't account for long-term sustainability. What you're developing could help break that cycle. With Simon's initial investment, they established a modest headquarters in a vacant storefront on Golden Prairie's Main Street. The location was symbolic, positioning the cutting-edge agricultural initiative in the heart of rural America rather than within the urban centers where agricultural policy and research were typically developed. The growing network faced immediate challenges. Conventional agriculture organizations questioned their methods, defending established practices and casting doubt on preliminary results. Agricultural supply companies became concerned about approaches that might reduce farmer dependence on their products, and local agricultural lenders were hesitant to finance transition practices without long-term proven returns. Yet for every obstacle, unexpected supporters emerged. A regional bank president, after touring Jackson Acres and witnessing the reduced input costs and improved drought resilience, developed a specialized loan program for farmers implementing regenerative transitions. A nonprofit focused on water conservation provided monitoring equipment to document the reduced irrigation requirements of fields with improved soil health. Most significantly, farmers themselves became the network's most powerful advocates. As Rebecca Torres' pilot project began showing measurable improvements, her willingness to share detailed financial data provided compelling evidence for others considering similar transitions. We've reduced irrigation costs by 35% in just the first season, Rebecca explained during a network gathering that had grown to include over 50 local farmers. The cover crop investment was offset by reduced fertilizer needs, and we're seeing soil organic matter increasing for the first time in decades. As winter settled over the Great Plains, Amelia found herself increasingly torn between her institutional role at the Barrett Institute and her growing commitment to the Heartland Resilience Network. The limited approval for her Kansas project had come with implicit expectations that it would remain a secondary research interest, not consume her primary focus or challenge the Institute's established research directions. Yet the network was demanding more of her time and intellectual energy as it expanded beyond its initial scope. Farmers across 3 states were now implementing pilot projects. University researchers were requesting collaboration on studies documenting soil health improvements and water conservation impacts. And policy experts were beginning to explore how agricultural support programs might be restructured to incentivize regenerative practices. The tension came to a head in early February when Lawrence called Amelia into his office. On his desk lay a farming journal featuring an article about the Heartland Resilience Network, with Amelia quoted extensively about the limitations of genetic-only approaches to agricultural challenges. Several board members have expressed concerns about potential conflicts of interest. Lawrence began, his tone carefully measured. While your Kansas research initiative was approved, there's a feeling that your involvement with this network may compromise your objectivity regarding the Institute's primary research directions. Amelia had anticipated this conversation but still felt a flutter of anxiety. Her position at the Barrett Institute represented years of professional advancement and financial security. My research with the network directly informs my work here, she countered. It's providing insights into how our modified crop strains perform under varying soil conditions, data that strengthens our core products. Lawrence sighed, removing his glasses to rub the bridge of his nose. Amelia, I've supported your career since you joined us, but I need to be direct. Agricor has specifically questioned whether your public statements about integrated approaches might undermine market confidence in their product pipeline. They're our largest funding partner. The implicit choice was clear: limit her involvement with the network or risk her position at the Institute. Amelia took a deep breath, weighing years of institutional loyalty against her growing conviction about the path forward. I understand the concern, she said finally. But I also believe that the Barrett Institute has an opportunity to lead rather than resist this transition. Integrated approaches represent the future of agricultural resilience. We can either help shape that future or eventually be rendered obsolete by it. The conversation ended without resolution, a temporary détente that Amelia knew was unsustainable. As she drove to Kansas that weekend for a network planning session, winter fields stretching bare and dormant on either side of the highway, she contemplated the growing divergence in her professional path. The network gathering in Golden Prairie revealed how rapidly their initiative was expanding. What had begun with Daniel's farm and Rebecca's pilot project now encompassed 17 implementation sites across Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. Farmers reported preliminary results that consistently showed improved water retention, reduced input costs, and promising signs of soil regeneration. Most surprising was the diversity of participants. Alongside smaller family farms were representatives from 2 large agricultural operations, conventional farmers seeking alternatives as drought conditions intensified and input costs soared. University researchers from 3 state agricultural programs had begun formal studies documenting the outcomes. A regional grocery chain had expressed interest in creating a premium market for crops grown using regenerative practices. During a break in the presentations, Daniel found Amelia staring out the window at Golden Prairie's Main Street, where the network headquarters had become a hub of unexpected activity in the formerly struggling town. Something's troubling you, he observed, his familiarity with her expressions having deepened through months of collaboration. Amelia described her conversation with Lawrence, the implicit ultimatum, and the growing tension between her institutional role and her conviction about their integrated approach. So what will you do? Daniel asked, the direct question characteristic of his communication style. I don't know yet, she admitted. The Institute provides resources and scientific credibility that benefit the network. Leaving would mean sacrificing that platform. Daniel considered this, his expression thoughtful. When I left Cornell, many colleagues told me I was committing career suicide. Trading academic influence for a family farm seemed irrational from their perspective. Do you ever regret it? Amelia asked. Not for a moment, he replied without hesitation. There's a difference between having institutional influence and creating actual change. Sometimes the most effective path doesn't follow established channels. As they rejoined the gathering, Simon Garcia was outlining plans to scale the network's impact through technology platforms that could facilitate knowledge sharing and data analysis across participating farms. The potential here goes beyond the Midwest, he explained, gesturing to maps showing drought vulnerability across global agricultural regions. The principles you're developing could be adapted for agricultural systems worldwide. But we need to systematize the knowledge and create accessible transition pathways. The discussion that followed centered on balancing rapid expansion with rigorous validation, maintaining scientific credibility while creating practical implementation tools for farmers facing immediate climate challenges. The tension between institutional pace and urgent needs echoed Amelia's personal dilemma. By the time she returned to Chicago, a late winter storm had blanketed the city in snow, the Barrett Institute's modern glass building gleaming against the white landscape. In her office overlooking the urban panorama so different from the Kansas horizons, she found a formal letter requesting her presence at a special review of her research affiliations. The institutional machinery was moving toward a forced choice. As she prepared for the review, gathering data and organizing her defense of the network's importance, Amelia reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a broken-down car on a rural Kansas highway. What had started as a chance encounter had blossomed into a vision that challenged not just agricultural practices but the very structures that governed innovation and implementation in American farming. The Heartland Resilience Network represented a fundamentally different approach, bottom-up rather than top-down, integrated rather than specialized, collaborative rather than proprietary. The network was gaining momentum independent of institutional approval, driven by farmers seeing results on their land, researchers documenting ecological improvements, and financial partners recognizing the economic potential of regenerative transitions. Yet Amelia still believed that mainstream scientific institutions like the Barrett Institute had crucial roles to play if they could adapt their approach and expand their vision. As snow fell silently outside her window, Amelia began drafting not just her defense for the upcoming review, but a more ambitious proposal. A framework for how the Barrett Institute might evolve to lead rather than resist the integrated agricultural revolution taking root in America's heartland. Whether her vision could overcome institutional inertia and corporate influence remained uncertain, but the seeds of change had been planted and were proving remarkably resilient. The review meeting would represent a crossroads, not just for Amelia's career, but for the relationship between establishment agricultural science and the grassroots innovation emerging from places like Jackson Acres. The outcome would either bridge these worlds or force a choice between them, with consequences extending far beyond Amelia's personal journey or the Barrett Institute's research priorities. The Barrett Institute's special review meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in March. Amelia arrived an hour early, watching dawn break over Lake Michigan from her office as she prepared for what would likely be the most consequential professional confrontation of her career. The stack of data reports, financial analyses, and farmer testimonials she had compiled stood ready on her desk, evidence of the growing success of the Heartland Resilience Network. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from Daniel. Whatever happens today, remember what we've already built can't be undone. The farmers have seen the results with their own eyes. The message steadied her. Daniel's pragmatic optimism had become an anchor during the increasingly turbulent navigation of her dual roles. Before she could respond, her office phone rang. It was Lawrence's assistant requesting her immediate presence in the director's office. "The review meeting has been moved up?" Amelia asked, glancing at the clock. "No," the assistant replied, her tone revealing nothing. "Dr. Barton would like to speak with you privately before the committee convenes." When Amelia entered Lawrence's corner office, she immediately sensed something had changed. The usually composed director looked uncharacteristically tense, standing behind his desk rather than seated. On the polished surface lay a financial newspaper, folded open to a headline that sent a chill through Amelia. Agricor announces acquisition of Barrett Institute Research Division. I was informed yesterday evening, Lawrence said without preamble. The board finalized the deal last week. Effective next month, the Drought Resistance Research Division becomes a wholly owned subsidiary of Agricor Agricultural Technology Group. Amelia felt the floor shift beneath her. The Barrett Institute had always maintained at least nominal independence from its corporate sponsors, preserving the appearance of scientific objectivity even as funding steered research priorities. Direct acquisition represented a fundamental transformation and a clear threat to her integrated agriculture initiative. What does this mean for ongoing research projects? She asked, her mind racing through implications. Lawrence's expression conveyed genuine regret. Agricor has requested a comprehensive review of all current initiatives. Projects aligned with their product development roadmap will receive expanded funding. Others will be, he hesitated, searching for the diplomatic term, reconsidered. The Integrated Agricultural Resilience Initiative promotes approaches that could reduce dependence on their product lines, Amelia stated flatly, naming the obvious conflict. Which is precisely why I wanted to speak with you before the review meeting, Lawrence replied, lowering his voice though they were alone. Malcolm Reed, Agricor's head of R&D, will be attending. He's requested specific information about your Kansas work, including all data from the Torres Farm pilot project and complete documentation of the soil management protocols developed at Jackson Acres. The request's implication was clear, not evaluation, but appropriation. Agricor wanted to extract potentially valuable components of the integrated approach while discarding the holistic framework that challenged their business model. Those protocols were developed independently by Daniel Jackson. Amelia responded carefully, they aren't Barrett Institute intellectual property. The situation is complex, Lawrence acknowledged. Any research conducted while you're employed here, even in collaboration with external parties, falls under Institute data rights according to your contract. Amelia felt a surge of protective anger. The farmers in the network had shared their land, their knowledge, and their financial risk because they trusted her to develop solutions that would help them, not to extract techniques that could be commercialized and sold back to them. Lawrence sighed, removing his glasses, a gesture Amelia had come to recognize as signaling his personal rather than professional perspective. I built this institute to bridge academic research and practical agricultural applications. I believed we could maintain scientific integrity while working with commercial partners. He gestured toward the newspaper. This acquisition suggests I was naive. What are you suggesting? Amelia asked, studying her longtime mentor. I'm not suggesting anything, Lawrence replied, replacing his glasses and straightening his posture. I'm simply informing you of developments that might influence your presentation to the review committee. He glanced meaningfully at his watch, which convenes in 45 minutes. The implicit message was clear. Amelia had a brief window to protect the network's research before it potentially became corporate property. She returned to her office, her mind racing through options that suddenly seemed severely constrained. Her first call was to Daniel, quickly explaining the situation. Agricor is acquiring the Barrett Institute's research division. They want all the network data, including your soil management protocols. Can they do that? Daniel asked, his usual calm voice tightened with concern. Legally, it's complicated. Ethically, it's a clear violation of what we promised network participants, Amelia said, glancing at the clock. I have about 30 minutes before I need to face their R&D director. I'm trying to figure out how to protect what we've built. The soil protocols aren't the issue, Daniel said after a moment's thought. Those are based on principles that can't be patented. What we need to protect is the integrated system and the farmer's autonomy to implement it without becoming dependent on corporate products. As they discussed options, Amelia's computer chimed with an incoming email from Simon Garcia. The tech entrepreneur had been meeting with international agricultural organizations about expanding the network's approach globally. His message was brief but consequential. Foundation-approved funding package, $10 million for 5-year expansion of network work. Call me ASAP. The timing represented both opportunity and complication. Significant independent funding could free the network from institutional constraints, but the Barrett Institute could claim rights to research conducted under their auspices. The next hour would determine whether the integrated approach they had developed would remain a farmer-centered initiative or be dismantled into marketable components controlled by agrochemical interests. When Amelia entered the conference room for the review meeting, she immediately noted the changed atmosphere. Alongside the familiar faces of the executive committee sat Malcolm Reed, Agricor's research director, a thin man whose reptilian gaze suggested he assessed everything in terms of extractable value. Dr. Winters, Lawrence began with formal courtesy. Given recent developments, we've modified the agenda for today's review. Mr. Reed has some specific questions about your Kansas research initiative. Malcolm leaned forward, fingers steepled. I'll be direct, Dr. Winters. Agricor is interested in certain elements of what you've termed integrated agricultural resilience, particularly the soil microbial amendments and moisture retention techniques. We believe these might complement our existing product line if properly developed. The careful phrasing revealed their strategy: extract techniques that could be commercialized while disregarding the holistic approach that made those techniques effective, precisely what Daniel had warned about from the beginning. Amelia placed her presentation folder on the table but didn't open it. I appreciate your interest, Mr. Reed. However, the success of our approach depends on integration. The synergy between multiple practices working together as a system extracting individual components would likely prove disappointing. We have substantial R&D capabilities to refine promising techniques, Reed countered smoothly. What we're proposing is a focused development program for the most commercially viable elements. Agricor could scale these solutions far beyond what your network of individual farmers could achieve. The phrasing was clever, positioning corporate extraction as benevolent amplification. Amelia recognized the trap being laid, agreed that some elements were separable from the whole, and the integrated vision would be conceptually dismantled before any legal questions arose. Our data consistently shows that the approach works as an integrated system, she responded, choosing her words carefully. The soil amendments require specific planting patterns to maximize effectiveness. The moisture retention techniques depend on undisturbed fungal networks that are compromised by certain chemical applications. Reed's expression hardened slightly. The Institute's legal team has reviewed your employment contract, Dr. Winters. Research conducted during your tenure here belongs to the Barrett Institute, which will soon be part of Agricor. We're offering you the opportunity to continue leading development of selected components with substantially increased resources. The threat beneath the offer was clear: cooperate in dismantling the integrated approach or be sidelined entirely with the research claimed regardless. Amelia felt a momentary vertigo as years of career advancement and professional identity teetered on the precipice of a decision that now seemed inevitable. Before we continue, she said, her voice steadier than she felt, I should inform the committee of a recent development. The Heartland Resilience Network has secured independent funding for expansion, $10 million over 5 years from a consortium of agricultural foundations. The announcement landed like a stone in still water, ripples of surprise moving across the faces around the table. Lawrence raised an eyebrow, silently acknowledging her tactical move. That's irrelevant to this discussion, Reed responded dismissively. The research methodologies and data remain Institute property. Actually, Amelia countered, sliding a document from her folder, I've had our work reviewed by independent legal counsel. The network operates under a cooperative research agreement that specifically protects participating farmers' autonomy and data rights. She turned to Lawrence. You signed this agreement 4 months ago when we expanded beyond the initial pilot project. Lawrence examined the document with an inscrutable expression. Amelia knew he recognized it, though perhaps he hadn't fully appreciated its implications when approving what had seemed like routine paperwork for external collaboration. This appears to establish joint ownership of research outcomes, Lawrence noted carefully, with provisions protecting farmer implementations from proprietary restrictions. Reed's face flushed with barely contained anger. This is highly irregular. The Institute cannot simply sign away rights to research conducted by its employees using its resources. The agreement acknowledges Barrett Institute contributions and rights, Amelia explained. What it prevents is exclusive control or restrictions on implementing the integrated approach. The participating farmers invested their land, time, and financial risk in developing these methods. The agreement simply ensures they maintain the right to use what they helped create. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point when Amelia's phone chimed with an incoming message. Normally, she would have ignored it during such a critical meeting, but the screen showed Daniel's name and instinct told her to check it. The message was brief but explosive. Agricor researcher spotted taking soil samples from Torres farm without permission this morning. Rebecca confronted them. They claimed Barrett Institute authorization. Amelia looked up from her phone to find Reed studying her with cold calculation. Is there a problem, Dr. Winters? Did you authorize soil sampling at the Torres farm in Kansas this morning? She asked directly. The momentary flicker in Reed's expression confirmed what the message suggested. Agricor had already begun appropriating the network's research, attempting to extract the microbial components of the integrated system while bypassing the collaborative framework. We have legitimate research interests in all Barrett Institute field sites, Reed replied, his careful phrasing neither confirming nor denying the specific accusation. Amelia turned to Lawrence, whose expression had transformed from diplomatic neutrality to genuine concern. The agreement explicitly requires participant consent for any sample collection or data gathering, she reminded him. Unauthorized sampling represents a breach that could expose both the Institute and Agricor to legal action from network participants. The calculated risk she was taking became evident in Reed's response, a dismissive wave that revealed contempt for the farmers whose collaboration had made the research possible. These are routine scientific procedures. No commercial farmer would seriously object to standard soil analysis. These aren't just commercial farmers, Amelia replied, her voice taking on an edge. They're research partners who've entrusted their land and livelihoods to a vision of agriculture that prioritizes long-term resilience over short-term extraction, a vision that's already showing remarkable results. She opened her presentation folder finally, laying out satellite imagery comparing conventional farms suffering under drought conditions with the vibrant green of network implementation sites. This is from last month, the worst February rainfall deficit in 30 years. The integrated approach isn't just showing marginal improvements, it's demonstrating transformative resilience precisely when it's most needed. Lawrence studied the images with evident interest despite the tense atmosphere. These results are compelling, Amelia, but Mr. Reed raises valid concerns about institutional interests and research ownership. Which is why I'd like to propose a solution, Amelia responded, extracting the final document from her folder, one she had prepared during the frantic 30 minutes before the meeting, hoping it wouldn't be necessary. This is my resignation from the Barrett Institute, effective immediately, she said, placing the letter before Lawrence. I'll be joining the Heartland Resilience Network as its research director, focusing on expanding implementation of the integrated approach developed collaboratively with network participants. The resignation represented her nuclear option, sacrificing her prestigious position and institutional resources to protect the network's integrity. The move would likely trigger complex legal questions about research ownership, but it would create immediate separation between her future work and Barrett Institute claims. This is unnecessary and potentially damaging to your career, Lawrence said quietly, genuine concern evident beneath his institutional role. There must be a compromise that preserves both the Institute's interests and your research direction. I agree, Amelia replied, meeting her mentor's gaze. Which is why my letter includes a proposed memorandum of understanding. The Barrett Institute would retain rights to publish all research conducted during my tenure and could continue studies on specific components of the integrated approach. In exchange, the network participants would maintain autonomy to implement the complete system without restriction or licensing requirements. Reed began to object, but Lawrence raised a hand to silence him, studying the proposed memorandum with the careful attention of someone navigating treacherous terrain. After several long moments, he removed his glasses and addressed the room. "I believe Dr. Winters has identified a reasonable path forward. The Barrett Institute's mission has always been advancing agricultural science that benefits both industry and farming communities. This arrangement would allow continued scientific development while respecting the collaborative nature of the research." "This is completely unacceptable," Reed interjected, his corporate calculation giving way to open frustration. "The acquisition agreement specifically includes all current research assets." "The agreement includes all research assets legally belonging to the Institute," Lawrence corrected him. "If portions of this research are governed by prior agreements establishing joint ownership or implementation rights, those must be respected. Otherwise, Agricor could face significant legal challenges from multiple parties." The implicit threat that Lawrence would not support Agricor in overriding existing agreements shifted the power dynamic in the room. As Institute Director, his interpretation of research ownership carried substantial weight, even with the pending acquisition. "We should discuss this privately," Reed said finally, his tone suggesting the conversation was far from over. "Of course," Lawrence agreed. "Dr. Winters will need time to review your proposal. Please maintain your current research activities pending our decision." The careful wording suggested Lawrence was creating space for negotiation, asking Amelia to delay her resignation while he navigated the corporate transition. It was a request for trust from a mentor who had supported her career despite occasional differences in research philosophy. As Amelia left the Barrett Institute that afternoon, spring rain washed Chicago's streets in reflective shimmers that mirrored her uncertain state. Her career hung suspended between institutional science and grassroots innovation, between corporate research structures and farmer-led implementation. The network she had helped build was demonstrating remarkable results, but its future remained precarious amid competing interests and power dynamics. In her car, she called Daniel to update him on the confrontation and its ambiguous conclusion. "We forced them to acknowledge the cooperative framework, but Agricor won't surrender easily," she said. "They'll look for legal angles to extract what they want from our research." "The soil is still the soil," Daniel replied, his practical wisdom grounding her academic concerns. "The microbes are still the microbes. They can take samples and study components, but the living system resists reduction. That's both its scientific reality and its protection." His perspective reminded Amelia of the core truth she'd witnessed at Jackson Acres. The integrated system Daniel had developed wasn't just a collection of techniques, but a living, interconnected whole that defied corporate extraction. The resilience of the land, the fungal networks, the companion plants, they worked together in ways that couldn't be neatly packaged into a product for sale. This realization steadied her as she drove through the rain-soaked streets of Chicago, her mind already shifting toward the next steps for the Heartland Resilience Network. The battle with Agricor might continue, but the network's momentum was now rooted in the real-world outcomes farmers were experiencing. Outcomes that no corporate legal maneuver could erase. Over the next few weeks, Amelia and Daniel worked tirelessly to solidify the network's foundation. With Simon Garcia's $10 million funding commitment, they expanded their headquarters in Golden Prairie, hiring a small team of researchers, data analysts, and agricultural extension specialists to coordinate the growing number of implementation sites. The 17 pilot projects across Kansas, Nebraska, and Oklahoma became 50 by early summer as more farmers, spurred by Rebecca Torres' documented success, joined the movement. Rebecca's 40-acre plot, once a barren stretch of depleted soil, now thrived with a diversity of crops, corn interplanted with clover and wildflowers, its soil organic matter up by 25% in just 8 months. Her irrigation costs had dropped by 40%, and her yields were matching conventional levels despite the region's ongoing drought. At a network gathering in June, Rebecca stood before 75 farmers, her voice steady with conviction. "This isn't just about growing food," she said, gesturing to her revitalized fields. It's about growing a future where we're not at the mercy of chemical companies or drought cycles. Amelia, now officially the research director of the Heartland Resilience Network after her resignation from the Barrett Institute took effect, presented the latest data. Across all sites, water usage was down by an average of 45%. Chemical inputs by 70% and soil health metrics, organic matter, microbial diversity, water retention showed consistent improvement. Financial analyses, supported by the regional bank's new loan program, demonstrated that transition costs were offset within 2 years by reduced input expenses, with long-term profitability surpassing conventional models. These numbers weren't just statistics, they were lifelines for farmers facing mounting pressures from climate change and economic volatility. The network's success didn't go unnoticed. By late summer, national media outlets began covering the Kansas farming revolution, as one headline dubbed it. Articles in agricultural journals and mainstream publications alike highlighted the integrated approach, often featuring photos of Jackson Acres' vibrant fields and quotes from farmers like Rebecca who transformed their operations. A documentary crew from a sustainable agriculture nonprofit visited Golden Prairie, filming interviews with Daniel, Amelia, and network participants for a feature that would later win awards at environmental film festivals. The increased visibility brought both opportunities and challenges. Foundations and climate-focused organizations offered additional funding, allowing the network to establish training programs for farmers in other drought-prone regions, including Texas and California. But it also drew renewed attention from AgriCorps and other agribusiness giants who intensified their efforts to discredit the regenerative movement as unscientific and economically unviable. Amelia and Daniel countered these criticisms with data and transparency, hosting open field days where skeptical researchers and policymakers could see the results for themselves. At one such event in September, a USDA official, initially dubious, examined soil samples from a network farm and admitted, "I've never seen microbial activity this high in a production field. This isn't just theory, it's a game changer." His endorsement led to a pilot partnership with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, providing federal grants to farmers adopting network practices, a significant step toward mainstream acceptance. Meanwhile, AgriCorps' legal team pursued their claim to the network's research, arguing that Amelia's work at the Barrett Institute entitled them to intellectual property rights. The case dragged on for months, creating a cloud of uncertainty. But the cooperative agreement Amelia had secured early in the network's development proved a critical safeguard. Farmers like Rebecca, supported by pro bono legal assistance from a rural advocacy group, countersued, alleging AgriCorps' unauthorized soil sampling violated their rights as research partners. The legal battle culminated in a settlement in early 2026. AgriCorps gained limited access to published data from Amelia's time at the Barrett Institute but was barred from patenting or restricting the integrated system's implementation. The farmers retained full autonomy to use the practices they'd helped develop, a victory that reinforced the network's farmer-centered ethos. By May 2027, 2 years after Amelia's car had broken down on that Kansas highway, the Heartland Resilience Network had grown beyond anyone's expectations. A conference held at Rebecca Torres' farm drew over 500 attendees, farmers, researchers, policymakers, and international delegates from drought-affected regions in Africa and South America. The once struggling 40-acre plot now served as a living classroom, its fields a testament to the power of integrated agriculture. Corn, soybeans, and native grasses grew in harmonious patterns, their roots supported by a thriving underground network of fungi and bacteria. Pollinators buzzed among wildflowers, and soil tests showed carbon sequestration levels that made the farm a model for climate mitigation. Amelia took the stage for the keynote address, her tailored blazer replaced by a practical jacket suited for fieldwork, her Chicago polish softened by the easy confidence of someone who'd found her true calling. 2 years ago, she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I thought resilience meant engineering plants to survive a broken system. But here, with all of you, I've learned it's about rebuilding the system itself from the soil up through relationships that connect us to the land and to each other. She presented the latest data, 300 network sites across 12 states, with an average 40% reduction in water use, 50% higher yields under drought conditions, and soil health improvements that promised long-term sustainability. The numbers were met with applause, but the real impact was in the stories shared by farmers who'd once faced foreclosure but now saw a path forward. Daniel joined her on stage, his reserved demeanor unchanged despite the network's success. He shared soil data from Rebecca's farm, comparing it to samples taken at Jackson Acres years earlier. The patterns are the same, he said simply. The land heals when we work with its natural systems, not against them. His words echoed a deeper transformation Amelia had undergone. We've both evolved beyond our programming, she added, smiling at him. I used to think in terms of controlled variables, now I think in terms of living relationships. Below them, the conference buzzed with energy, farmers exchanging tips, researchers discussing new studies, and children playing in a field that had once been barren. The network's influence extended beyond the fields. Financial systems adapted, with insurers offering lower premiums for regenerative farms due to their reduced risk profiles. Policy shifts followed as state governments in the Midwest began incentivizing soil health practices inspired by the network's model. Even the Barrett Institute, under new leadership after Lawrence's retirement, established a regenerative agriculture division acknowledging the integrated approach's value, though Amelia declined their offer to return. Content with her role in the network. As the conference concluded, Amelia and Daniel stood on a small hill overlooking Rebecca's farm, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields. The air smelled of earth and growth, a stark contrast to the sterile laboratories where Amelia had once spent her days. It's strange to think this all started with a blown head gasket, she said, a note of wonder in her voice. Daniel chuckled, a rare sound that warmed the cooling evening. Sometimes the best journeys begin with a breakdown, he replied. The land and the people were ready for something new. We just helped them see it. Below, the celebration continued, a movement born from serendipity, now a beacon of hope for farmers facing an uncertain future. The Heartland Resilience Network wasn't just changing agriculture, it was redefining what resilience meant in a warming world, proving that the strongest systems, like the healthiest soils, thrived on connection, diversity, and a willingness to evolve. Up next, we've got two more incredible stories waiting for you on your screen. If you loved this journey of transformation, click to watch, subscribe, and hit the bell. We've got more inspiring tales coming your way.